What we've got on the table here is the new Deepcool Matrix 70, which we're going to be doing a full-fledged 4K video editing PC on. Now this just isn't any overpriced 4K video editing rig where money's no object. I've actually done this with a budget in mind, using all the best value parts that you'd want for something of a caliber of editing 4K videos. Now I picked this up on a bargain, 32GB kit of 2800 megahertz memory, and I'll put the link for a lot of this stuff in the description below. We've got a 240GB SSD, 2TB hard drive, X399 ASRock Fatality motherboard, 12-core, 24-thread, 2920X, 850-watt power supply, and an RTX 2070, which has 8GB of VRAM and is a pretty good choice for video editing. Now Deepcool did send in this Matrix 70 and also their 240 Pro and some fans, which you can add those two elements in if you wish to go with the Deepcool look. But this case in particular is going to be the main focus. We saw this earlier in the year at CES in its final form. It's coming in at $75 in Australia, about 119 Aussie dollars. Now this case, at its price point compared to the competitors' options, wants to offer quick release on the front panel, the back, and also the side, where you can easily quickly clean your filters and inside and change parts if you need to do that. You can just detach it via 2 screws at the top, on the side, and at the rear, 2 screws on the rear. The back panel had no problems. That can sort of hang freely if you leave it. But the tempered glass side panel here had some sort of lowrider issues where it was hanging out very far. And I was really worried to the point where I left it there for about 20 seconds and it fell off completely. So if you are getting one of these cases, I wouldn't leave this tempered glass panel hanging around. I'd just take it off and not rely on the sort of quick release open feature where you can have that winged look. And you can mount at the front of the case 3 140mm fans or a 360mm rad, and at the top you can do the exact same thing. In terms of graphics cards, you can support up to a 380mm long card, and the case also supports extended ATX motherboards. And just a quick interlude, this hard drive cage has seriously been banged up in shipping. I mean, I'm lucky the tempered glass isn't busted. If you guys didn't know, the last Deepcool case that I got sent in the mail had broken glass everywhere. It just came pre-shattered. I'll put the link to that video up here if you haven't seen it already, but I don't know, Deepcool, you've got to use a different shipping carrier because this is the second time in a row that a product has come damaged. And I'm guessing that side tempered glass lowrider aspect as well is a result of the damage in shipping. But anyway, I'm sure your luck is not going to be as bad as mine. We've got 4 SSD drive mounts here, and also the option to mount an additional 2 2.5-inch drives down in the cages or 2 3.5-inch drives. The power supply mounts in through the rear here, has its own separate dust filter, and speaking of dust filters, you get detachable dust filters at the front and also the top of the case. And lastly, the Deepcool logo down the bottom is transparent, so you can mount some RGB LED strips behind that if you wish for it to light up. With that said, let's put together this whole rig and see how it turns out. And we'll also be testing the temperatures of this case with the side panel on versus off. Very simple test to do to see if the airflow is good. And with that said, we're going to be mounting 3 MF120Ss at the front of this case, which nowadays is the classical enthusiast setup. 3 fans here, radiator at the top, and also 1 fan exhausting at the rear. So here we are now at the next day with the Matrix 70, and this honestly took me so much longer than I'm used to spending on a PC build. The reason being is we got so much RGB cables to route at the back. So this is my first complaint, I guess, is if you're using 3 Deepcool fans at the front coupled with their 240 Pro, then their hub only has 5 inputs for the fans. So I ended up having to use 2 hubs for the RGB fans. And it just ended up being 2 different connectors to control the RGB. It was seriously a bit annoying when it came to all these cables and having to manage that and then also zip tie them, coupled with the fact that I've got to use 2 controllers now if I want to control the RGB itself. But in terms of the case and how it performed, we'll get onto some tests very soon. But first off, I did manage to test out the 240 Pro, their all-in-one cooler, and this actually really surprised me. I came into this thinking this would be another mediocre Deepcool water cooler, which in the past I thought their air coolers have performed a lot better than their water coolers, but this honestly kept up with the H15i Platinum RGB, and that's my favorite all-in-one at the moment, and that's a 280mm with 2 140mm fans. This at a 240mm solution did very well when I tested on the 9900K at 5 GHz. It came in at 98 degrees and the noises were very well controlled, but here's where the noises differ a little bit to the H115i Plat, which has its own included controller for those fan speeds, which is automatically controlled. This here, you have to use your motherboard's PWM, so noises and fan speeds are going to differ depending on what fan settings you have set in your motherboard. But in terms of the actual cooler and the performance, it did extremely well. But here's the kicker though, on AM4, with the tests I'm doing here, I'm actually not really going to recommend it because the block size is way too small for AM4 CPUs. It's probably covering half the CPU at best, but it's fine with a 12 core and you will get away with it. But if you're stepping things up to a 16 core or the 24 or 32 cores, then I would recommend getting a cooler with a bigger block that covers the whole CPU area. But in terms of the cooler itself, they have made the right improvements in the right direction. They tell me it's got a 3-phase motor and zirconium ceramic bearings, and also internal dynamic pressurized control. Very fancy terms, but at the end of the day, I just like to sit down, do the tests, and the numbers will always speak for the product itself. And so the 240 Pro is actually pretty impressive. It does come in at 120 USD and 174 AUD, so you will have to like the look of this cooler because there are options out there that do come in a similar price point and do provide lower noise, like the H115i RGB Platinum, for example. That's still my favorite all-in-one. The noises are just that little bit quieter, especially on full fan speeds. But lastly now, with this case, we're gonna run some tests while the side panel is off and then put it back on while we're playing games and then check the before and after temperatures, which is the most important thing to see if this case has been designed properly. So we just finished out testing the temperatures of this case in Apex Legends, and the GPU temperatures mainly, which is what we're focusing on. I set the fan speeds manually to 80%, and with the side panel on, it got up to 60 degrees while we're playing games in a 26-degree ambient environment, and then with the side panel off, it went down to 55 degrees. So it's a case that is mediocre in terms of its attributes for cooling down your components inside. I guess with that said, it's more of a bling orientated case, but it's still far from the worst. If you guys watched my $500 PC recently, you would have seen the temperatures there were about 10 degrees with the side panel on versus off, so that was pretty bad. This one here is about 5 degrees. Some of the better examples, like the Air 540, for example, the temperatures actually decrease when you put the side panel on because it allows the airflow to get directed from the front out through the rear in a channel, and when you take the panel off, that channel's disrupted. But irregardless of all that, this case is coming in at 75 USD, or at least that's what I can find it for from B&H Photo. I think it's going to be released right around when this video here is released. In Australia, I think it's 119 Aussie dollars, and both these prices, I believe, don't come with any RGB fans. You just get one fan at the back of the case. And I guess the distinguishing factors here from other cases is that glass panel above the power supply that sort of is actually a nice addition. I don't mind it. I thought it was a little bit tacky. Then I started building it and I realized it's actually handy for putting in modular power supplies and routing your cables. And then after you install it, if your graphics card has some lighting on it, in the case of this RTX 2070 Galaxy card, does have the underglow and it does reflect off the glass at the bottom quite nicely. At the front of the case, however, the dust filter needs to be changed. It's one of those tacky ones that sort of has the clips on the edge and it blocks airflow. I thought you meant to have the dust filter in front of your fans, but in this case it's behind, and I do believe it actually affects airflow, as we saw with those temperatures. But having the dust filter behind does allow these three fans at the front to shine through and look really good in terms of bling. So I guess that's a trade-off. In terms of the dust filters up top and down bottom, they're very easy to remove. I do like those styles, so I wish they implemented that at the front of the case. In terms of airflow coming in from the front, it is a little bit weak. I'd like to see them improve that, but you can alleviate that a little bit by just pressing the button and opening that up, but you're still going to have the front hanging out if so. And the last thing I liked about this case was the top power buttons and input outputs had a nice glow ring around all the ports themselves. This was actually a nice touch. I thought that and also the glass above the power supply were two good additions implemented with the Matrix 70. But other than that, everything was really straightforward with this build, very easy to build in despite having a lot of cables and being very time consuming. It wasn't difficult to get it all done, so to speak, and there was no real sharp edges or anything that was intrusive. So solid build quality, solid case, but it does leave a little bit to be desired. In terms of a mid-range build, it's pretty good for that, but if you're going for real high-end components and you need really good airflow, may wish to consider something else. But at the same time, this case is only $75, or at least it's meant to come in at $70. I think that's what the Matrix 70 stands for. For me personally though, I did like the Matrix 55 with 3 RGB fans at front. I thought that was hitting really hard for the price point. This has a little bit of a different aesthetic with some additional features over that, and it depends if you want those features and if they're worth the money. Or if you're going for a non-overclocked build and you like the aesthetic of this case, then I can recommend it. But if you are going for a high-end build with like a 2080 Ti, for example, and overclocking CPU and GPU, then I would recommend going for something with better airflow. Anyway guys, that's about it for today's review of the Matrix 70. If you enjoyed this one, then be sure to hit that like button. Also, I will say probably the most impressive thing to come out of today's video was actually the Captain 240 Pro cooler, the all-in-one. That's made some significant improvements over the previous generation Deepcool all-in-ones. Of course, the support and the block size for TR4 could use some improvements in my opinion, but besides that, there's only some little things to fix up, and I think Deepcool will be on top of their game. In terms of these MF120s, if you want to get them, I'd really only be getting them for the looks. In terms of airflow, they're not that great. And lastly, although I'm controlling this via the controllers, it does have 5-volt addressable RGB support from the motherboard. So if you don't want to use a controller, then you can use the 5-volt header. In this case, the X399 board I have here actually didn't have one of those headers on board, so I did have to use the controllers. But the good thing about the hardware is that there's no software that won't eat up any resources. But all that aside, let us know what you think of the Deepcool Matrix 70, and I'll catch you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.